Welcome to another episode of Erik Wait Whiskey Studies, and in this video I'm going to talk about Inchgower Distillery and short versus long fermentations. Inchgower Distillery is located on the outskirts of Buckie, Moray in Lower Speyside, Scotland. Inchgower Distillery was named from Gaelic words possibly meaning field of the river or field of the goat, reflecting its location near River Lossy and its geographical setting. The name Inch is an anglicized form of Innis, which can mean island or field, and Gower comes from a Gaelic word gavar, meaning goat. The bird on Inchgower Distillery's logo is an oyster catcher. Inchgower Distillery was founded in 1871 and was built by Alexander Wilson and Company to replace Tocquenille Distillery. The distillery is currently owned by Diageo. They use an 8.4-ton stainless steel semi-lauter mash tun. They have 6 washbacks made from Oregon pine with a fermentation time of 48 to 53 hours. They have 2 wash stills and 2 spirit stills. The distillery has 13 dunnage and racked on-site warehouses which can house up to 60,000 casks. The distillery uses a combination of sherry and American oak casks, although sherry is used more often than the American oak. The majority of single malt produced at Inchgower Distillery is used in blending. The Bells family owned the distillery for a significant portion of time, and as a result, Inchgower became an important component in the Bells blends, as well as Johnny Walker and Whitehorse blends. Official bottlings released from Inchgower are rare. Official bottlings include the 14-year-old bottling that was released as part of the Flora and Fauna range, and the Rare Malts Collection bottlings, which have included a 22 and 27-year-old. Independent Inchgower bottlings are more common from Hunter Lang, Gordon and MacPhail, Douglas Lang, and the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. But only 1% of the spirit distilled at the site is actually sold as single malt. Scotch Malt Whisky Society Cask number 18.41, a Fascinating Dichotomy. This is an 11-year-old Inchgower Speyside single malt Scotch whiskey. It was aged for 11 years in first fill Oloroso hogsheads, distilled in June 2010. It is bottled at 59.7% ABV. The USA was allocated 102 bottles and it sold for $125. I'll be comparing the 11-year-old Inchgower from a Scotch Malt Whisky Society with the Tamdhu cask strength single malt Scotch whiskey batch number 5. This is a non-age statement whiskey, matured in 100% Oloroso sherry cask, bottled at 59.9% alcohol by volume, and still sells for around $99. Note that both these whiskeys are matured in Oloroso sherry cask and are very close in ABV, one being bottled at 59.7% ABV and the other at 59.9% ABV. Inchgower has a fermentation time of 46 to 53 hours, whereas Tamdhu has a fermentation time of 59 to 115 hours. So I'm pouring myself a little bit of the Inchgower from Scotch Malt Whisky Society and a little bit of this Tamdhu. This is an excellent opportunity to do a side-by-side comparison to learn about the differences between short and long fermentations. What you're going to want to do is find 2 whiskeys that in other respects have similar characteristics. Maybe it's age, regions such as Speyside, Highlands, cask type, but you want to be close in ABV and then compare a shorter fermentation versus a long fermentation. Now, when you see a range of fermentation times for a distillery, let's say 70 to 115, that doesn't mean that one day, hey, let's do it at 70 or one day at 15 or, we started the fermentation and this time it finished at 70 and this time it finished at 115. As if one fermentation reflects summertime, the other one reflects wintertime fermentations. A lot of distilleries, they want the characteristics that are going to come from a short fermentation But they also want some of the characteristics. They're going to come from a longer fermentation. So they'll do multiple fermentations at different lengths of time and then blend them together to produce both a nutty character, it's a malty nutty character, as well as a more fruity character. So a short fermentation will give you a more nutty, malty character. You can also get more malty character by using a rake and plow mash tun versus a lauter mash tun. Lauter has these blades that sort of go through the malt. A rake and plow will give you a cloudier wort, and it'll give you that more of that malty character. However, it gives you less sugar extraction, so most distilleries have converted to semi-lauter or full lauter mash tuns. Now, getting back to fermentation, just as you get a more malty character and nuttier character from a rake and plow mash tun, you can get from a shorter fermentation. A longer fermentation, you're going to get more fruity character and more floral character. For example, Ardbeg has around a 70-hour fermentation. That's fairly long. Fermentation is the conversion of sugar water, wort, using yeast. Yeast eats the sugar and produces carbon dioxide, alcohol, and some heat. So that's basically what fermentation is. The fermentation is typically complete around 50 to 55 hours. So actually, after 55 hours, you're still getting various esters from the contact or the time spent in the washback, but it's not actually still converting sugar into alcohol, but you're still getting more of those characteristics. So depending on what kind of profile a distillery wants, they're going to make decisions regarding fermentation time. Now, how do you affect fermentation time? How much yeast did you put in? More yeast, quicker conversion of sugar to alcohol. Temperature. Increase the temperature, increase the rate of fermentation. So there's a couple different ways in which you can affect the rate of fermentation. Now, I spent a day working at Ballinalloch Distillery in my last trip, and they do 4 fermentations and then combine them to get a general overall profile. So when you're looking at a distillery profile that has maybe a huge range of fermentation times, that's because they are doing multiple fermentations and blending them together, or more than likely. So, how then do you, in studying whiskey, get around to figuring out and understanding and perceiving that malty character, that nutty malty character? Well, one of the challenges is sherry casks already have a nutty character to them. So you have Fino, Amontillado, Oloroso, Palacantado, and Pedro Jimenez. Fino is matured biologically. Amontillado is some biological and some oxidative, and Oloroso and Palacantado are both oxidative. That oxidative maturation of Oloroso and Palacantado gives it that nutty character. It's called rancio, not rancid, although the word is related. More of that nutty character to it. So if you're using a sherry cask with a whiskey that had a short fermentation, how can you tell whether that nutty character is coming from the sherry cask or is it coming from the fermentation time, if you're sort of doing a blind tasting or retro engineering? Well, what you want to do is find 2 sherry cask whiskeys, similar ABV, one with a short fermentation, the Inchgower, and one with a long fermentation, the Tamdhu. And that is why I'm doing these 2 whiskeys side by side. Now, when I tasted the Inchgower from Scotch Malt Whiskey Society by itself, I was like, wow, that's pretty nutty. But then separately tasted the Tamdhu, I thought, well, that's got some nutty character to it. But when you taste them side by side, that is when you go, wow, and you can really tell the comparison. So, the Tamdhu I think the latest batch might be batch 7 or 8. This is batch 5. It's an older one, so the ABV might be different on a more recent release of Tamdhu. So, dried figs, dates, raisins, sort of a fig compote. Just a hint of dried oranges. A little bit of lemon, so you got a little citrus going on in there. The Inchgower. Similar in profile in terms of figs, dates, raisins, but just on the nose alone, you get a little bit of nuttiness. By the way, I should put just a drop of water. This ABV, it is got a little bit of a bite to it. I'm just going to put in one. And this is how you study whiskey, folks. Although I do whiskey reviews, this really is intended to be a study channel. And I share my trips to Scotland. I've been to Scotland 4 times, 49 distilleries. Went through the Springbank Whiskey School, spent 5 days. Best way to learn is to get some hands-on experience, which is very, very difficult to do. And then I spent a day at Ballincollig. Whoa. Yeah, even on the nose, that nuttiness is coming out. But if I was only smelling the Inchgower and not doing a side-by-side with the Tamdhu, I would say, oh yeah, it's got some nutty character there, but I wouldn't necessarily recognize that that's coming from the fermentation. I might think it's just coming from the casks. But when you can do a side-by-side, that's when it's really going to show up. So on the palate, So I've already reviewed this Tamdhu, under $100. If you can get one, I highly, highly recommend it. I think it's excellent, and it gives a lot of other sherry cask whiskeys a run for their money, particularly say Macallan, the Macallan, and it's actually got a nice fancy bottle. Drink a little water. The Inchgower. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. The nuttiness is really popping there. So I mentioned in my last video on Breval that these distilleries that rarely or very little is bottled as a single malt, that most of it goes into a blend, they are designed to be a component whiskey, an ingredient whiskey. They're not intended necessarily to provide the entire profile that you're necessarily going to want in a whiskey. So a blender making blended scotches, well, we're going to take a fruity whiskey, we're going to take a nutty whiskey, we're going to take this kind of cask, we're going to take a peated, we're going to take an unpeated, various characteristics, something maybe it's a little earthier, something that's a little more floral, and then we're going to take little bits and pieces, of these various whiskeys, and we're going to put them together to make the style of whiskey that we want. Okay, since there's already a nutty character that comes from the sherry cask, how then do you really want to understand a short fermentation, be able to detect it? Well, now you're going to want to look for a short fermentation whiskey that's not in a sherry cask. Abelauer has a fermentation time around 48 to 55 hours, give or take, somewhere in that range. So Abelauer typically does blends of, or a marriage of sherry cask and bourbon cask, although you can get 100% sherry cask. But what you're going to look for is a Budna Alba, and this is a whiskey I've already reviewed, because the characteristic of this whiskey is going to have more of that influence from the fermentation, or the shortness of the fermentation, and it's not going to be covered up by the sherry cask. So this whiskey, really, really nice whiskey, is going to be also more cask emphasis in terms of the bourbon cask, which is without any nuttiness or dried notes to sort of mask the nuttiness of the fermentation, and that nuttiness is going to come through. So this whiskey comes across as sort of like apple pie. It's got apple notes, cinnamon, baking spices, a lot of vanilla, so that the bourbon cask is there. But then there is this nuttiness that shows up that you might not otherwise recognize if it wasn't done in a bourbon cask. So, in studying fermentation times, look at various distilleries who have longer ones, who have shorter ones. Glenallachie, for example, has extremely long fermentation times. Ardbeg has extremely long fermentation times, 70 hours. This is why I love Ardbeg, because it has the earth and the smoke and the peat and that characteristic. But Ardbeg 10, for example, but they're using a bourbon cask and they have this long fermentation, and it's because they have that long fermentation that there's a lot of fruitiness comes through, a lot of lemon and lime in particular I get from Ardbeg 10-year-old. And that intense fruitiness from the longer fermentation is showing up and it's coming through all that smoke. So you're not just getting a lot of smoke and earth, you're getting a lot of intense fruitiness. And I like that counterbalance in the Ardbeg 10 between the earth, that kind of muddy character you get from Ardbeg, the smoke, barbecue character, and that intense fruitiness. So back to Inchgower and Tamdhu. Honestly, I prefer the Tamdhu. I think it has more balance. It has more full range. It's a little sweeter. It has a great mouthfeel. But this is really, really nice. And it has, if you put it on, add a little bit more water to it or drop the temperature on it, the oiliness of the whiskey and the viscosity of the whiskey, it gets really, really, really thick. So excellent whiskeys. But for these, I'd put them in 90 to 92 range. Absolutely superb. Alrighty, I hope you have enjoyed this video. You've learned from this video. If you've not already, I ask that you like and subscribe, give it a thumbs up. And until next time, cheers. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out these other whiskey videos.